We're going to switch now to a special report from CBS News involving the January 6th investigation and election interference. Let's listen.
CBS News has learned that attorneys for President Trump met with federal prosecutors in the special counsel's office last Thursday. Mr. Trump then posted on his social media not long after that meeting. And he wrote, "My attorneys had a productive meeting with the DOJ this morning, explaining in detail that I did nothing wrong, was advised by many lawyers, and that an indictment of me would only further destroy our country." CBS News correspondent Scott McFarland is outside the courthouse where the former president's indictment was just handed up by the grand jury. Scott?
It was at first sealed when it was handed up by this grand jury about 30 minutes ago. Now it's been released. It's a 45-page indictment with 4 felony charges. Let me read them to you, John. Conspiracy to defraud the United States, conspiracy to obstruct an official proceeding, obstruction of and attempting to obstruct an official proceeding, and conspiracy against rights. If that phrase, obstruction of an official proceeding, sounds familiar to you, it's because more than 300 of the January 6th riot defendants have faced that charge. The official proceeding being the January 6th electoral count. These are felony charges. Now, the second federal criminal case against former President Trump, just released here in federal court in Washington. This is where the case will exist, in Washington, D.C. And based upon the nomenclature of the case number, John, I can tell you this case appears to be assigned to Judge Tanya Chutkin, a 2014 Obama administration appointee who has been noticeably and particularly critical of what happened at the Capitol January 6th and has had some criticisms for the former president when she handles the sentencings of many of the January 6th defendants who've come through her court. So it's 4 charges that do align, John, with what we had from the target letter Donald Trump acknowledged receiving on July 15th. It's that language that indicated obstruction of an official proceeding and conspiracy against rights. We're going to read through the 45 pages of this indictment just released, as handed up by a grand jury and its foreperson at 5:15 Eastern Time today, August 1st, 2023.
Scott, we're looking right now at the front page of the indictment. And would you go through for us those 4 counts again, for those of us who are not as well versed in this as you are? And as you say, this tracks essentially what the expectation was. But go through those 4 counts again, if you would.
3 of them have the phrase conspiracy in them, which is somewhat common in a federal case and certainly begs the question, are there more defendants to come? Would it take more than one person to execute a conspiracy? It's conspiracy to defraud the United States, conspiracy to obstruct an official proceeding. Again, there's a very common charge from the Justice Department in January 6 cases overall. Obstruction of, an attempt to obstruct an official proceeding. Again, that official proceeding being the January 6th electoral count, which was very much obstructed for several hours that day. And conspiracy against rights, which is a broader term for a charge that goes against people who have power, positions of authority. In some cases, it's police officers facing that charge, or even judges in the past have faced that charge. In this case, it'd be a former president of the United States. There's a lot of granular detail in this indictment we're going to pick up on. But those 4 broad-based counts don't come as a surprise, John. Based on what was in the target letter Donald Trump received, there were certain statutes quoted in that target letter that indicated these very charges. But this is an initial indictment of Donald Trump. His first federal case is in the Southern District of Florida. His second federal case right here in the nation's capital in Washington.
And Scott, give us a sense very quickly, if you would, of the drama, if there was any, of this proceeding, or was it otherwise kind of business as usual in the federal courthouse?
This happened in what I would characterize as a garden variety way. The magistrate judge on duty, Mokshila Upadhyay, was handling grand jury returns today at about 5 p.m. Eastern Time. 2 different prosecutors came in. The Department of Justice prosecutor to hand up from a grand jury 2 different charges on 2 unrelated cases. And then an attorney who's been associated with special counsel Jack Smith's case came in and announced the handing up of 1 indictment. The grand jury foreperson in the case was there in the room. They didn't give the initials or the name of the defendant in that case, as is often the case when grand jury indictments are returned. They said they wanted that case sealed. Well, it is now suddenly available and unsealed to the public. A 4-count felony count indictment of the former president. And just one note, logistically here, when you have a federal felony case, a felony case, it has to come from a grand jury. A prosecutor doesn't do that unilaterally. It comes through the grand jury system, which is why we've been on high alert throughout this day, because the grand jury was seen here early this morning, departed here mid-afternoon, but the grand jury foreperson wasn't seen leaving. So we were expecting some movement in court, and it happened after court closing hours at about 5:15 Eastern.
All right, Scott McFarland, thank you so much with the latest reporting. Robert Costa, your thoughts on these 4 charges?
This is a stunning moment in American history. A former president of the United States has been accused of trying to defraud the United States, and this was, in the words of the special counsel in this indictment, a sprawling conspiracy to overturn a presidential election, not with Trump as some kind of accomplice, but as the person really spearheading the entire operation inside the Oval Office, pulling every lever of power, trying to pressure his vice president to overturn the election. We know former Vice President Mike Pence has been a key witness in this January 6th investigation. Conspiracy to work with someone like John Eastman, the outside conservative lawyer who authored what's called a blueprint for a coup, a 2-page document saying that Trump could argue that there was, falsely argue that there was voter fraud, and thus the election needed to be sent back to the states. And why the term defraud the United States? Because the special counsel, based on our reporting, has been interviewing witness after witness saying, did Trump knowingly say he believed the election was rigged, even though he didn't have any evidence to back it up, but did he keep pushing this false claim? And they believe they have enough evidence, based on all of these witness interviews, that they can now say Trump went forward with these false claims constantly in front of the American people, knowing that they were not backed up by facts. Even if Rudy Giuliani was waving affidavits in the air, they didn't have credibility. This is an aggressive move by special counsel Jack Smith, not to paint Trump as someone who was called into some decision by outside lawyers, but Trump as the mastermind of an operation to overturn an election and take American democracy to the brink.
Major Karen.
So the indictment says the former president of the United States spread lies, that he knew that they were lies, and the things that he was saying, not only he had reason to know, but actually knew were false. And to pick up on Bob's point, that makes the former president the central actor in the greatest crisis played out on live television about the peaceful transition of power in our country's history. And the indictment holds him to account. And it's also reflective, we should point out, of criminal referrals made by the January 6th committee. The first 2 referrals it made were obstruction of an official proceeding, and number 2, conspiracy to defraud the United States. Those were the first 2 of the recommendations that came from the House Select Committee on January 6th, and they are reflected in this indictment. And the former president has said, well, I got lots of advice from lawyers. You're the president of the United States. You are the singular person who either can set this in motion or stop it. This indictment and the available record, public and otherwise, indicate and confirm he was the central actor, he set it in motion, and now the law and the facts will try to hold him accountable.
Jeff Begay's Jack Smith will speak at 6 o'clock this evening, we're being told. What do you make of this indictment?
Well, let me first talk about what we're expecting from Jack Smith, if you don't mind. Obviously, we're not expecting a lot. You've seen him before. He doesn't say a lot, barely smiles. That picture is pretty accurate there. But if you look at this indictment, this is built on the backs of the 1,060 people who've been arrested, charged, convicted so far in the nearly 31 months since January 6th. There were a lot of people early on who thought, oh, there's no way they're going to charge a former president. Well, of course, if they believe he is the ringleader. And that's what you see in this indictment. There's a lot of work that has been going into this, not only by the special counsel's office, but also the U.S. attorney here in D.C. who has prosecuted all these people who followed the orders of the former president's supporters, as well as the president himself, come to Washington, D.C. They did. Some of them came armed. And, of course, we saw what happened, and 1,000 of those people, and there are going to be more. You know, that investigation hasn't ended. This one hasn't really ended either. There's more to come.
There's some breaking news. Trump, the campaign, has responded. This whole indictment now, these series of indictments come in the middle of a presidential campaign. Trump's the Republican frontrunner in the 2024 race, and he is calling this, through his campaign tonight in his statement, election interference. And he's saying the Department of Justice is weaponized. And let me just read you one sentence from the statement from the Trump campaign to understand how the stakes are being laid out by Trump and his allies. The lawlessness of these persecutions of President Trump and his supporters is reminiscent of Nazi Germany in the 1930s, the former Soviet Union, and other authoritarian dictatorial regimes. So this is not just a response to a legal proceeding. This is a politically charged and historically dramatic moment with real gravity for what this country can endure in terms of American democracy when something's being compared by the Republican frontrunner to something that occurred in Nazi Germany, all while the investigation, as Jeff said, continues apace.
The former president has cornered the political market on florid language, especially when he's in duress. But that doesn't make it legitimate, and it doesn't make it true. To call something election interference when you are being held to the legal account of this country for interfering in the peaceful transfer of power is not only ironic, it is a form of psychological projection. The former president of the United States clearly, if you read this indictment, and available to everyone who watched live television on January 6, 2021, set in motion an effort to slow down, if not interfere or block, a congressional proceeding to certify that presidential election. That happened. To hold him and anyone associated with him to account legally for all time in our nation's history is not the act of an authoritarian regime.
Scott McFarland has the latest on when former President Trump will show up. Scott?
Our latest reporting, John, is that Donald Trump will make an appearance here at the federal courthouse in Washington, 4 p.m. Eastern time on Thursday. In short order, 48 hours after he's charged, he'll make his appearance here in Washington, D.C. This courthouse is massive. It's like the size of a small college basketball arena, 6 floors, dozens of courtrooms, many judges. His appearance will be before the same magistrate judge to whom this indictment was handed up today, Judge Mokshila Upadhyay. She's the magistrate judge who handles initial appearances. In some cases, she handles arraignments. That's where Donald Trump will appear. If it's in her courtroom, it's the 2nd floor, courtroom 5 of this federal courthouse, but any number of security protocols will likely go into place, just like they did in Manhattan when the former president appeared there for court, just like they did in Miami when the former president appeared there for court. There are 3 entrances to this courthouse. It's a giant, and likely some of the areas here will be closed off for what is typically in the federal system a short initial appearance, measured in minutes. Not a lengthy procedure, but nevertheless an historic procedure with Donald Trump appearing here in 2 days.
Scott McFarland, thank you. Bob, quickly.
So as we read over this indictment of Trump, it's very important to note, as our colleague Graham Cates has noted in his reporting, that there are multiple co-conspirators listed on pages 3 and 4 of the indictment. And it's suggestive of people who are working with Trump, an attorney who willingly spread knowingly false claims to pursue strategies related to Vice President Pence's ceremonial role overseeing the certification, a political consultant who helped implement a plan to submit false fraudulent slates. So what you see from this document, and if you carefully read it, page 3 and 4 and other pages here, is that this was an operation alleged by the special counsel to have taken place on multiple fronts. Trump pushing people in the states, in the state legislatures, at the Republican state level, to try to send back alternative slates and to have activists act as so-called fake electors. At the same time, he wanted members of Congress to overturn the election on January 6, 2021. At the same time, he wanted the Justice Department to give their imprimatur and to say that the election was in some way corrupted by election false election action by people on the ground. And he wanted the vice president to be involved. So you really see the special counsel detailing everything and calling it a co-conspirator at work.
6 unindicted co-conspirators in the indictment.
Whose names we don't know yet.
We do not know yet.
Let's bring in Ricky Kleeman, CBS News legal analyst. Ricky, the special prosecutor says that the former president, shortly after the election of November 3rd, 2020, the defendant launched his criminal scheme. I'd like your take on what that means, but one more item from the indictment. It states that Trump widely disseminated his false claims of election fraud for months, despite the fact that he knew and in many cases was informed directly that they were not true. What's your thought about a criminal scheme and what you've been able to tell so far from this indictment?
Well, of a 145-page indictment, John, we're looking at, out of a 45-page indictment, we're looking at 130 paragraphs, which detail facts that create the elements of criminal offenses. There may be a political overlay here, and we can talk about the political overlay at another time, but right now, what we have in front of us is something that is a document that charges a person with criminal offenses that create prison time, and it is the result of a painstaking investigation. When we hear the word conspiracy, what also ought to come to mind is the timing. We are now on August 1st. We have a case that is supposed to come to indictment because the prosecutor has said so in Georgia. And Fani Willis, that prosecutor, has talked about the possibility of looking at a criminal scheme, same words, but as a RICO conspiracy, a racketeering influence, organized, corrupt conspiracy. One of the reasons that I believe Jack Smith finished up and got this out now was he needs his indictment to be first so that any indictment in Georgia does not try to supersede or contradict the Department of Justice indictment. And what's important to me here, John, is who are the victims. Not only all those Congress people and the people who were working in Congress on January 6th during that terrible day, but also it's the voters. It's the civil rights violation. Whose rights were abrogated? It's the voters, in the sense that their votes were going to try to be taken away by a scheme that had gone on for months to say that those votes in those 7 states should be flipped. And that's what stands out to me.
Ricky Kleeman, thank you very much. With us now is Scott Frederickson, a former federal prosecutor. Scott, pick up wherever you would like, but also would you address this notion that the former president mentioned in one of his social media posts? He said he was told by lawyers. Bob Costa has been reporting that may be one of the prongs of his defense, which is, I was just following the wise legal counsel of those around me. Major also addressed this. How much of a shield is that in this case?
Well, I think the indictment meets that head on. 5 of the unindicted co-conspirators are attorneys, his own attorneys, except for one who was a Justice Department attorney. There is a advice of counsel defense, but you don't have an advice of counsel defense when your own attorneys are your co-conspirators. If you assert an advice of counsel, you waive that privilege, and that means the prosecutors get to look at all those communications. An attorney cannot advise you to commit a crime, and you can't rely on that as a defense. So early on in the indictment, Special Counsel Smith lists 6 unindicted co-conspirators. 5 of those are attorneys. 4 of those are Trump's own attorneys. So, you know, he's entitled to a fair trial, but frankly, that kind of blasts any idea of advice of counsel right out of the water.
All right, Scott Frederickson, thank you. Oh, go ahead.
There's a couple other things that I think we should know. Right out of the box, the special counsel makes clear that his case is based on the premise that this was a president who was determined to stay in power and to do it by spreading lies about the false election, lies about the lies about it being stolen. The other thing that we were waiting to see is whether, as part of the conspiracy, the special counsel would bring in the January 6th riot and insurrection, and he did. Part of the manner and means of the conspiracy as alleged in the indictment is that when it became apparent the Vice President Pence, would not agree to stop his electoral college counting, which confirmed the election of President Biden, the former president encouraged a violent crowd to go to the Capitol, and they attempted to exploit that. So we didn't know if that was coming as well. The rest of it is incendiary, but as expected. use of false state electors, false certificates, the rendition of all the facts showing the president was told over and over again by a variety of people that his lie about the election being stolen was in fact false and was a lie, and he knew it. So all of that's laid out in this indictment in fairly clear form.
Scott Frederickson, former federal prosecutor, thank you so much. We now have Democratic Congressman and former January 6th committee member Jamie Raskin joins us now. Congressman, this was obviously something, a recommendation was made by the January 6th committee. How does this indictment square with what the committee wanted, and how much further does it go?
Well, it's parallel to what we suggested, and I think it's a very elegant sequencing of what took place, because there was a conspiracy to interfere with the federal proceeding, the joint session of Congress, to receive and count the electoral votes. There was a conspiracy to defraud the American people by assembling all of these counterfeit electors and then presenting them as a justification for setting aside the lawful constitutional proceeding and moving in a different direction, just to name Donald Trump essentially the new president. And then all of it was galvanized for the purpose of conspiring to substitute this phony result for the actual voting rights of the people. And that count, to me, is an echo of what Abraham Lincoln said about insurrection back at the beginning of the Civil War, where he said that violent insurrection is fundamentally an assault on the rights of the people to choose their own leaders. And that's essentially what this indictment is saying in the form of a criminal prosecution. This was an effort to steal away the actual lawful election result and the voting rights of the people by substituting a completely counterfeit and fraudulent process.
Congressman, you and the committee were unable to speak to some people within the Trump inner circle, former Chief of Staff Meadows, Rudy Giuliani, the Vice President, Mike Pence. I don't know if you have had a chance to read through all of this, but even if you haven't, what would you be looking for to see whether the special counsel's investigative skills built upon the case that you laid out in those hearings? Or have you seen anything in what you've been able to read that suggests that he was able to make the case more thoroughly in some of these areas that you all were investigating on the committee?
Well, I've only been able to give it a cursory read, but it's quite parallel to what the committee found. Of course, we included one statutory charge that appears to be omitted here, which is aiding and abetting and giving comfort to an insurrection. And of course, we don't know why either the grand jury decided not to vote a charge there, or Jack Smith decided not to bring that charge before the grand jury. It is a statute that has not been used very much, and it's one that has not been constitutionally tested in the Supreme Court. So maybe they decided there is such a superabundance of other criminal violations that are evident that there was no reason to go to that one. But otherwise, they found pretty much as we found. This was an attempt to overthrow the election result, to usurp the voting rights of the people, to interfere with a federal proceeding, and to establish a counterfeit electoral process to supplant the actual one that exists under the Constitution and under federal and state law. So I feel very pleased that this is such a vindication of the rule of law in America, and that this grand jury saw what the January 6th committee saw when we tried to analyze the chaos and the violence that had been unleashed against America, not just on January 6th, but in the weeks leading up to it.
All right, Congressman Jamie Raskin, thank you so much for being with us. We are waiting for the special counsel to go to those microphones you're looking at. He's scheduled for 6 o'clock, and we'll go to him the minute he utters his first syllable. Until then, congressional correspondent Nicole Killian is outside of the Fulton County Courthouse in Atlanta. Nicole, remind us why you're there, and has there been any reaction down in Atlanta to this indictment?
Yeah, well, certainly this is on the radar of Fulton County District Attorney Fani Willis. In fact, we heard from the Fulton County Sheriff earlier today who spoke to reporters who echoed what we've heard from the district attorney here is that they are ready to go in terms of their own case that they have been pursuing in regards to alleged 2020 election interference. And the sheriff noted that it is even possible that he could send a team to Washington to observe in the event that the former president is arraigned and makes a court appearance in Washington, D.C. That is something that they did not only in Miami when the former president appeared there, but also in New York to prepare, because we are currently in a window where the district attorney at any time could announce a charging decision in her investigation, which has spanned for more than 2 years. And of course, the centerpiece of that investigation is a phone call that was made to Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger in the days right before January 6th, where the former president pressed Raffensperger saying, you know, find me the 11,760 votes in an attempt or hope to perhaps overturn the election results here in the state of Georgia. We know that the Secretary of State not only appeared before a special purpose grand jury here in Fulton County, but also met with federal prosecutors. And that call is also cited in the indictment that was unsealed today. So while there is some overlap with these cases, of course, they are quite different in nature and scope as well. But we do expect a potential indictment here in Fulton County within a matter of weeks, John.
Nicole Killian, congressional correspondent in Fulton County, on just one of the portions of what the special counsel has called a criminal scheme by the former president that he alleges was launched just after Election Day on November 3rd, 2020. As far as the current sitting president is concerned, Chief White House correspondent Nancy Cordes is with President Biden. Nancy?
John, we're in Rehoboth Beach, Delaware, where President Biden is on vacation, keeping a low profile. We have asked the White House for any reaction to this indictment, but we don't expect to get one, frankly. This White House repeatedly, when asked about indictments, when asked about charges against the former president, when asked anything about these ongoing investigations, tends to say nothing, or as little as possible, referring us to the Department of Justice. Everyone at the White House, from the president on down, has said that they don't want to influence DOJ in any way. But that doesn't mean that President Biden hasn't weighed in on his predecessor's actions, especially when it comes to January 6th. He doesn't talk about it very often, but when he has been scathing, John. On the one-year anniversary of January 6th, he accused former President Trump of rallying the mob to attack. He said he watched it all on TV from the White House dining room near the Oval Office and did nothing for hours as police were assaulted. He accused him of spreading a web of lies, not just on January 6th, but months before the election even took place. And he said that the former president ignored what he was being told by his own attorney general, his own vice president, and governors from every state in the nation about the validity of the 2020 election. We don't hear much from this president anymore, particularly not as this investigation heated up about his predecessor's actions. He has tried to be very careful, knowing that this is going to be an ongoing issue as we get closer to his repeat matchup, if you will, against former President Trump.
Nancy Cordes with President Biden, White House correspondent. Thank you so much, Nancy. Scott McFarland has some more details as we wait for the special counsel to walk to the microphones. Scott, what do you know about the judge?
If you go to the last quarter of the indictment, you see references to January 6th. A lot of talk about fake electors, a lot of talk about what was known about the election. But if you get to the bottom quarter, you see references to what the special counsel calls the defendant's exploitation of the violence and the chaos at the Capitol. And one of the references is to then House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy in a conversation Donald Trump had during the riot with Kevin McCarthy, in which there was a reference, according to the special counsel, that you seem more concerned about the election than they seem more concerned about the election than you do, Mr. McCarthy. But also, note where this case is headed. It's headed here to Washington, D.C., to federal court, and assigned to Judge Tanya Chutkin, a 2014 appointee of this court, an Obama administration appointee who will be handling this case after the magistrate judge has her hearing with Donald Trump on Thursday.
Scott, briefly, and I might have to leave you because the special counsel's due any moment, but what's security like there, and how, I imagine when the former president shows up, it's going to be quite severe.
A lot of reinforcements here. The U.S. Marshals are here. U.S. Park Police and D.C. Police all have some type of foothold at this courthouse when there's major events. We expect that to ratchet up exponentially Thursday afternoon for this 4 p.m. Eastern Time court appearance.
Scott McFarland, thank you. Just quickly, Jeff Pegues, the security, you've covered this now for this is the third one. Each time, significant measures have to be taken.
Yeah, and we didn't really see that in Miami. You saw the court appearance there. There weren't enough barricades was the concern. Miami police thought they did a good enough job. But in Washington, D.C., because of all of the landmarks here, because of all the public activity on the streets any given day, you're going to have to set up a lot of barricades. You're going to have to coordinate between federal and local law enforcement. And of course, on January 6th, there was criticism about how well or how intelligence and law enforcement efforts sort of fell apart leading up to January 6th. And so they're not going to want a repeat of that. Sure. They're going to make sure that they coordinate with D.C. Homeland Security to prepare.
And visually, it will be an echo, in a sense, if the former president's supporters arrive, as they did in Miami and as they did in Manhattan, it will echo the scenes of that very day.
Yeah, but the crowds have not been that big. Yeah. Why? Because a lot of people are facing criminal charges for following President Trump's orders and showing up here in Washington.
Certainly smaller numbers than the former president had hoped or led people to believe there might be on his behalf. One of the things that the indictment makes very clear, and it's an important point in this moment in American history, the indictment makes clear something that is fundamentally true but needs to be stated in a legal document like this. The defendant had a right, like every American, to speak publicly about the election and to even claim falsely that there had been outcome-determinative fraud during the election and that he had won. He was also entitled to formally challenge the result of the election. I'm reading from the indictment directly. It also says, after exhausting all of those legitimate legal means and being shown that he lost, the president then became malicious about holding on to power. And the idea that he can speak about this, raise questions, pursue legal avenues, all of that is legitimate. And he did that. But once he lost there, he made a fundamental decision, one never before made by any sitting chief executive in the history of this country, to take other means to hold on to power. And that is the central question in this indictment and will be the central question before the jury.
There are rules for fighting these things out. He didn't play by them.
No.
And we build on what Major just said. It's such an important point. December 30th, 2020, Donald Trump has a conversation, then president, with Steve Bannon. Pence is on vacation as vice president. He says, get Pence home. Pence is now the target. Because as Major said, everything had failed for Trump and Giuliani in the courts. They were struggling to have any kind of strategy moving ahead. The electors had already voted in mid-December of 2020. December 30th, a turning point. Focus on Pence. That's what Bannon and other outside advisors tell Trump. And on January 3rd, Pence goes to the Senate parliamentarian, and she tells him, sir, you have nothing to do on January 6th except count the votes. He says, well, that's what my lawyers have been telling me. That's what I'm going to do. The next day, January 4th, 2021, John Eastman, the conservative lawyer who authors this blueprint for a coup, in the Oval with Pence. And Trump confronts Pence face-to-face in front of Eastman and other lawyers, and he says to Pence, listen to John. Almost threatening, based on our reporting. Listen to John. Follow the Eastman plan. Pence says, I'll still think about it. Let me take my time, but I can't do it, Mr. President. The next day, Trump calls in on January 5th, Pence into the Oval Office for the ultimate one-on-one with Trump. Trump is so into the moment, and this has been confirmed by testimony in front of the January 6th committee. He opens the door to the Oval Office so he can hear the gathering mob outside on Freedom Plaza. A freezing cold night. Some of the aides to Trump walk in the Oval Office and they say to themselves, why is the door open? Gus Savera coming in the room. But Trump wants to hear the mob outside, and he says to Pence, infamously, based on our reporting, you have to do this for me, Mike. You have to do this for me. Walk away from the certification on January 6th, because what was the hope? That the certification would be delayed. And if it was delayed, then the conspiracy would be effective in Trump's eyes, because the states where at least Republicans controlled the legislatures could send new electoral slates.
And Major, this is not just a question about the past. What you were talking about is there is a system for adjudicating disputes in America, and the president did not play by that system. And we're coming up with another election, and there are many people who thought it wasn't that he played outside the rules, it was that he didn't play hard enough outside the rules.
Well, there might be some who believe that. He could have played harder. I don't know quite how he could have played any harder. As Bob has articulated, he tried to use the Justice Department, he tried to use the Department of Homeland Security, he tried to use his political apparatus, he tried to convince state legislatures. I mean, just about every lever he could think of to pull, he tried to pull. And we have an established record on this. These are not disputable facts. They aren't. And the testimony that makes them indisputable facts comes from not Democrats who hate former President Trump, not think tank people who are not aligned with the Republican Party stalwarts, Trump administration stalwarts, people handpicked by the former president. They are the central and most important witnesses in this case, and they will be as this case unfolds. We've had close elections in our history, John. You know this as well as I do. 1800, 1824, 1876, 1960, 2000. And every single one of those close elections in which the fate of the country was in the balance for those who were most aggressively competing for that power, all of them had a central choice to make. Do I try to undermine this system, or do I live within its guardrails? Every single previous president lived within those guardrails until this one.
And one thing we have not mentioned, as a result of January 6th, 5 police officers died. I mean, think about those pictures. I will never forget the picture of the guy beating on the officer with an American flagpole. To me, that said it all. This was a mob attacking these police officers, and too often, I think, and I'm sure the families of the officers feel the same way, they get lost in all this. But that was a violent day.
Bob, Greg Jacob, lawyer for the vice president, as I recall, there's this question of whether the president was just listening to his lawyers. There was some testimony in the January 6th hearings, as I recall, that from Greg Jacob, that the president was told by John Eastman that this was not a legal theory, that this idea of fake electors was not legal, and that goes to this question.
You're basically asking Pence for a small violation of election law. That's a direct quote from the January 6th investigation.
There is in that testimony, which suggested that, which undermines this idea that the president
that it was foundational, that it was legitimate, that it was the body of understood law in America. It wasn't the body of understood law by any stretch of the imagination.
And what you see from John Eastman is someone who comes out of the orbit, who's not part of Trump's inner circle. But in the final days of the Trump administration, he's looking for anyone who's going to give him an exit ramp, a path to stay in power. That's why Sidney Powell is in the White House. She's up in the residence of the White House talking with Trump about potentially seizing voting machines. And that's why John Eastman, who was not known by Trump, a lawyer from California, is brought in because he says, well, there might be a way. But you're right, Greg Jacob, the counsel for then Vice President Pence, in that January 4th meeting, Pence says to Eastman, why don't you just go meet with my lawyer, Greg Jacob, and hash it out? And so they have a private meeting in the old executive office building, John Eastman and Greg Jacob. And in that meeting, based on under oath testimony from Greg Jacob before the January 6th committee, Eastman reportedly says, well, I did float this theory to Trump, and I have authored this memo, but I'm not really sure it's going to hold water. And Jacob explodes. In fact, he's a mild-mannered person, but he explodes in terms of being a lawyer, saying, how is this circulating at the highest levels of the federal government? Yet Eastman persisted, because even on January 6th, when the Capitol is under siege, Jacob talks about how he's communicating with Eastman via text messages and email, and Eastman saying, follow the plan, follow the plan.
And Major, this is something the former president still believes now. All of these things, he hasn't changed his mind on the legality of it and the outcome of the election, as wrong as they both may be.
No, he hasn't. As a matter of fact, he's even waded into the possibility of becoming president again and issuing pardons for anyone implicated in this. So that puts in a nutshell his approach to the facts, to the law, and to power. If he reclaims it, he will pardon those who helped put this in motion.
Jeff Begay's, we got about a minute, apparently, until Jack Smith shows up. He doesn't say a whole lot when he comes out.
No, he doesn't. As you guys know, I sort of bumped into him on a plane to Miami, and I was just watching his mannerisms just to see if he would crack a smile with his team, maybe drink something. I didn't see anything like that. He seemed focused, even sitting. I think he was sitting in a middle seat, may have been a window seat, but sort of blended in. Most people on the plane, I don't think they knew who he was. And he wasn't trying to draw attention, but we just spotted him.
And what do we...
Part of history now.
Yeah. I think
Indelibly.
he's done, I think, 100 triathlons, so I think he has the fortitude to make it through a middle seat. What do we know about his operation? It's been pretty unleaky, just as these kinds of investigations go. Does it have a character to it?
Jack Smith's character. The prosecutors that he has on that team, they are among the best. They are pros, they are major league prosecutors. And you see that because there really aren't a lot of leaks coming out of that office. People will say, oh, there really aren't that many leaks. They do their speaking through these court documents, and that's why these court documents are so detailed, because in a lot of ways they're trying to respond to what the former president puts out on social media.
Well, and that raises the question as we watch, perhaps here we have the special counsel entering the room now. And let's pause to listen to Jack Smith as he addresses reporters.
Good evening. Today, an indictment was unsealed, charging Donald J. Trump with conspiring to defraud the United States, conspiring to disenfranchise voters, and conspiring and attempting to obstruct an official proceeding. The indictment was issued by a grand jury of citizens, and it sets forth the crimes charged in detail. I encourage everyone to read it in full. The attack on our nation's capital on January 6, 2021, was an unprecedented assault on the seat of American democracy. As described in the indictment, it was fueled by lies. Lies by the defendant targeted at obstructing a bedrock function of the U.S. government, the nation's process of collecting, counting, and certifying the results of the presidential election. The men and women of law enforcement who defended the U.S. Capitol on January 6th are heroes. They are patriots, and they are the very best of us. They did not just defend a building or the people sheltering in it. They put their lives on the line to defend who we are as a country and as a people. They defended the very institutions and principles that define the United States. Since the attack on our Capitol, the Department of Justice has remained committed to ensuring accountability for those criminally responsible for what happened that day. This case is brought consistent with that commitment, and our investigation of other individuals continues. In this case, my office will seek a speedy trial so that our evidence can be tested in court and judged by a jury of citizens. In the meantime, I must emphasize that the indictment is only an allegation and that the defendant must be presumed innocent until proven guilty beyond a reasonable doubt in a court of law. I would like to thank the members of the Federal Bureau of Investigation who are working on this investigation with my office, as well as the many career prosecutors and law enforcement agents from around the country who have worked on previous January 6th investigations. These women and men are public servants of the very highest order, and it is a privilege to work alongside them. Thank you.
Why didn't you charge any of the other co-conspirators in this matter?
And there we have Special Prosecutor Jack Smith saying this is an unprecedented act, an attack on the bedrock function of democracy. He was typically laconic. Bob Costa.
One thing to note that the special counsel did not is former Vice President Mike Pence, based on this document, is a central, crucial, key witness in this investigation. This indictment says Pence took contemporaneous notes, and date after date of Pence's recollection of events is there. We know Pence met for hours with the grand jury, but to have a former vice president who was in the room with Trump, often one-on-one, in the Oval Office, and now testifying in detail to the special counsel, he could end up being the most important witness in this case.
Because do you think, Bob, it's not just X happened after Y, but he has some ability to speak to what was inside the former president's
And he can
head.
speak to possible criminal intent. Now, Pence has said publicly he does not know, and it's not for him to judge whether Trump had criminal intent in his actions. But by Pence detailing what Trump said, for example, this indictment says Pence recalled Trump calling him not too honest, as they had a private conversation about the election. And so Pence is someone who was weaponized at the end of the presidency for Trump. And to have him cooperating with the investigation gives the special counsel an eyewitness account that someone who's not a lawyer or some Trump functionary.
And to put this in a political context, let's also remind ourselves that the former vice president is now challenging the former president for the nomination of the Republican Party in 2024. So he is a witness against the former president, as Bob Costa just outlined, and is a political opponent against him. And he is a primary fact witness and a constitutional empowered officer of the executive branch. And that makes him the most important, or if not the most important, one of the most important fact witnesses, because he saw this entire progression of the argument through all of the ways that Trump was thwarted through the legal means of challenging the election. Then he went to extra legal means, and he was the recipient of maximum pressure on that extra, according to the indictment, extrajudicial pressure to overturn the election.
But here's the thing. You know, a lot of this obviously, allegedly, happened behind closed doors. But what's so frustrating sometimes about the former president is that he'll say things publicly where a prosecutor or even his own attorney would be flabbergasted, just telling him, please stop, don't keep putting this information out there. So a lot of what is in this happened publicly.
We're going to turn now to Scott Frederickson, a former federal prosecutor. Scott, what's your take after taking a look at this and listening to the special prosecutor in his remarks?
Yes, I think one thing that strikes anyone who has watched Special Counsel Smith is that he does not show emotion very often. He showed emotion today when he talked about the fact that this indictment is brought consistent with the prosecutions of the individuals responsible for the deaths of 5 law enforcement officers and the mob, the violent mob that attacked the Capitol. And when he talked about that here at his brief news conference, you could see he was emotional about that, and that is driving him when he said this was an assault on democracy fueled by lies of a president.
And just to underscore that, Scott, so the point is that while in the political realm this might get discussed in all kinds of maybe even abstract ways or in political terms, what it sounds like he was doing is saying 2 bedrock principles: accountability and also that there were real victims here who held the line when somebody else was trying to cross it.
Well, I think you're absolutely right. And I think what surprises most of us here is how much of the January 6th events have been made a part of this indictment. Many thought that he would avoid that and the incitement of the violent mob coming up the Capitol. Instead, it's a central part of the indictment, especially when he gets into the detailed rendition of the attempts to change the vice president's mind in almost a Shakespearean mano face-off, but detailing falsehoods over and over again told by the former President Trump in an attempt to change the vice president's mind.
Former federal prosecutor Scott Frederickson, thank you. Ricky Kleeman, our CBS News legal analyst, is with us now. Ricky, you've taken a longer look at this indictment. What else have you concluded? We're going to go back to Ricky in a second. Bob Costa, you know the players so well in this drama. Sticking with your idea, your point about the president being the central actor here, if Mike Pence is another key person, who else are you looking for as a useful witness for some of what we don't know or what the special prosecutor may have come up with in this indictment?
So I'll always remember the night of January 5th, I was outside the Willard Hotel. And while Trump had a hotel for most of the time he was president of the United States in Washington, down on Pennsylvania Avenue, the other Trump hotel on the eve of the insurrection was the historic Willard Hotel. Because inside that hotel on January 5th, Rudy Giuliani, Steve Bannon, and so many of their associates were calling Republicans in Congress. They were pressuring them to do Trump's bidding. They infamously issued a statement saying Pence was in agreement with Trump's position on January 6th, even when he was not, causing Pence to erupt along with his aides and say that's false. And so you have the Willard under the microscope now. Everyone who was inside the Willard plotting with Giuliani and Boris Epstein and all of these other associates to try to overturn the election, and those outside who were intent, getting ready for the rally the next day and to attack the Capitol, and then, of course, across the street at the White House talking to Trump late into the night. All of these people are now in the spotlight based on this indictment of the special counsel. He is not just painting this, based on this indictment, as something that was a bit of a bad idea gone wrong. He is saying that there was criminal intent to deceive the American people, to defraud the United States, and to mount a multi-pronged conspiracy. It's hard to digest that this is being alleged to happen, and it's being done by the Justice Department at the highest levels against the Republican frontrunner.
Right, indeed.
And the indictment pays the former president a compliment, indirectly, in the sense that his vocalizing falsehoods about the election had a dramatic, galvanizing, and impassioning effect on much of the country. Reading from page 2, to make his knowingly false claims appear legitimate, create an intense national atmosphere of mistrust and anger, and erode public faith in the administration of the election. The indictment says the former president achieved all of that just by the sound of his voice. Conferring upon him one of the things that former President Trump likes to say about himself. He has a movement, he has a voice, and people respond to it. All true, former President Trump. But you use that voice, you use that influence in ways that are now putting you in criminal danger.
Knowingly used it to advance a criminal scheme. Ricky Kleeman is apparently back on the line. Ricky, you've taken a further look at this indictment. What do you come up with?
When I look back, John, at my prosecutorial days, what I wanted to know were who are the victims, what did they suffer, and how did they suffer? Well, the major victim here, of course, is democracy. The secondary, or perhaps in tandem victim, are the American people. The third victim are the American voters. All of those go together. But when we look at the individual paragraphs, what we have to remember, in addition to the people in Congress who might have suffered serious bodily harm, injury, and even death, what we have to also look at is Mike Pence as a central victim in this indictment, and that Mike Pence became a person that Donald Trump, according to the indictment, wanted to do his bidding, and that was to change the election result, that Mike was supposed to do the quote-unquote right thing. But when he didn't, at the time that the Capitol is being breached, that Donald Trump's tweet, when he goes and says that Mike Pence didn't have the courage to do what should have been done to protect our country, etc., which is in paragraph 111, that is what spurs on the chance of hang Mike Pence. And if Mike Pence had not been spirited away by his Secret Service, he might not be running for the nomination today.
CBS legal analyst Ricky Kleeman, thank you so much. Ricky, now we want to go to Chief White House Correspondent Nancy Cordes, who has a thought. Nancy?
John, it was notable in that brief statement that we just heard from the special counsel, Jack Smith. One of the things he did say was that he's going to be seeking a speedy trial. That's notable because we know that he's not getting a speedy trial in the case in Florida having to do with former President Trump's handling of classified documents. That case is not going to go to trial until at least mid-2024, just a few months before the presidential election. If he were to get a speedy trial in this case, let's say early 2024, then the trial could take place and we could have an outcome well before the 2024 election takes place in November, possibly even before the end of primary season. And that's notable, of course, because President Trump is currently the runaway frontrunner, according to recent polls. And actually, his lead appears to be growing all the time. This is something that the Biden campaign is obviously watching very closely because they are anticipating a matchup again against former President Trump. But when we asked the Biden campaign whether they had any reaction to this new indictment, they said, as predicted, no comment.
Nancy Cordes, thank you, Nancy. Scott Frederickson, I want to bring you back in on something that Nancy hinted at, the calendar. But let's forget the political calendar for the second. How does whoever is in charge here operate all these different investigations and indictments and court trials all at the same time? There are the president's indicted 3 times, plus there are several civil cases. How does all that get coordinated?
Well, it's a good question. There's no formula. It's not provided for in any federal rule, let alone any state rule. Oftentimes, it's the first case indicted, and they take it in turn. But I think what's interesting here is that this case, which will come to the arraignment for the former president on Thursday, this case could actually jump ahead of the Mar-a-Lago documents case for one important reason. There are no classified documents involved in this case, and the classified documents are a serious complexity in the Mar-a-Lago scheduling. It takes a lot of time to work through those issues. There are none of that issues here. So I wouldn't be totally surprised if this judge, the new judge here in Washington, took this case and moved it ahead and moved it into early 2023 ahead of the Mar-a-Lago case. Of course, the former president will fight that and want to delay it till after the trial. But I think the judge could also make a point that this is the most important case. This is the one indictment that charges criminal conduct while the president was in fact in office as the president, unlike the other cases. So it goes to the heart of kind of the most important charges against him. So I could see this case getting moved forward in an earlier time spot.
All right, Scott Frederickson, thank you for that analysis of the calendar. Once again, former President Trump has been indicted by the special counsel on 4 counts tied to his attempt to overturn the results of the 2020 presidential election. Among the charges include conspiracy to defraud the United States and obstruction of an official proceeding. Our coverage will continue on CBS News Streaming, your local news, and tonight on the CBS Evening News. This has been a CBS News special report. For all of us here in Washington, I'm John Dickerson.